The Alchemist line of graphics cards has been interesting to follow to say the least. With initial poor DX9 and 11 performance, combined with an overall lack of software support, things started pretty rough as Intel had a long road ahead of them. Flash forward to over a year post-launch, and the support from developers has improved significantly, meaning these cards now do more than just work with applications, and they can run them pretty dang well. Before we get into this video, I'd like to say not to forget to hit the like button and subscribe, so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. Additionally, don't forget to leave a comment, especially if there's something that I missed. I can't cover every aspect of a card in the relatively short duration of a video, but I more so wanted to discuss some benchmarks, then dive into the specifications to further dissect its performance. Without anything else to say, let's dive into the test system to see how the A770 performs in games. To give the A770 a shot at fully stretching its legs, I've gone ahead and paired the card with an i5 13600K, a 6+8 core chip clocked to 5.5 GHz on the performance cores and 4 GHz on the efficiency cores. A higher end CPU could theoretically be paired with this card, but after running the benchmarks, I'm comfortable with coming to the conclusion that the i5 wasn't bottlenecking it. After rerunning some benchmarks with an i9 10850K and an i7 9700K, the A770 performed significantly better on the 13600K, especially when it came to the 1% lows, once again solidifying that the card is probably being paired with hardware that won't be holding it back. To keep the CPU and GPU fed with data, a 64GB memory pool was used clocked to 3.6 gigabit per second. This isn't the fastest memory available on the market, but it's pretty fast for a DDR4 kit and won't hinder the performance of our system due to capacity or latency issues. The specific motherboard and cooling solution used are in the description, along with other system spec details I thought were important to bring up. Without any further ado, let's dive into the Arc A770, and see how this card performs in games. Starting off with Apex Legends, a relatively lightweight competitive first-person shooter that shares a lot of DNA with the Call of Duty franchise. At competitive settings, the A770 never really struggled to run this game, with the 1080p results coming in at 219 FPS on average with a 1% low of 137 FPS. 1440p brought things down to 193 FPS on average, with the 1% low coming in at 133, which is actually surprisingly high considering where the 1% low came in at 1080p. 4K remained playable but wasn't really as technically competitive as 1440 or 1080p, with the average and 1% low coming in at 125 and 95 FPS respectively. Now, while these numbers may seem relatively good, especially when compared to what Arc was achieving just over a year ago, keep in mind that the RTX 4060, which is cheaper than this card, comes in at just over 20% faster at 1080p on average, basically performs the same at 1440p, and falls behind by about 6.5% when the resolution jumps up to 4K. I mean, yeah, you're not getting 16 gigs of VRAM, but if you're looking to strictly game and do nothing else, then you can find a cheaper card from both the red and green team that performs better while consuming under half the amount of power. This game overall ran well on the A770, and there isn't that much to complain about, even though it's a DirectX 11 based game, and those have a tendency to not perform particularly well on Alchemist cards. Borderlands 3, an Unreal Engine title based on DirectX 12, performed well only taking the A770 and A750's performance into account. With a 1080p average and 1% low of 141 and 26 FPS respectively, it's just barely high refresh rate capable. We are testing at the high settings though, so you can lower some of the settings if you want to increase your frame rate. But at the same time, the game starts to look kind of questionable at lower settings. 1440p returned an average and 1% low of 98 and 19 FPS, which was still playable but hints at some stuttering that, kind of strangely, went away once the resolution jumped up to 4K. With an average of 49 and a 1% low of 40, I wouldn't say that this is super playable, but the stuttering that was observed at 1080 and 1440p went away, which may be a small price to pay considering you are rendering 4 times the amount of pixels. Borderlands overall ran well on the A770, with the A750 trailing behind by about 8% depending on the resolution. But once again, the 4060 looms over it in this price category as a better choice thanks to its superior performance and overall lower power requirements. Up next is an updated classic that still manages to challenge GPUs released to this day. Crysis Remastered, a DirectX 11 game running at the medium settings across the board, with textures set to "Can it run Crysis?" At 1080p, the game performed pretty well, with the average coming in at 250 FPS and the 1% low at 162. This is beyond high refresh rate capable, and although I probably wouldn't really play through this game outside of a benchmark run, it ran very smoothly and was notable for having improved a lot on the Alchemist line of cards as a whole. This used to be one of those DirectX 11 games that performed poorly on release, and since then things have improved on not only the A770 but the A750 and also presumably the Arc 3 series as well. 1440p remained playable, with an average and 1% low of 182 and 121 FPS respectively. 4K was also still playable, but I probably wouldn't stick to this resolution because things just felt inconsistent. With an average of 87 FPS and a 1% low of 57, things seemed to run fine, but there was something, whether it be microstutter or overall slowdown, that just made me kind of cringe at this resolution. If ZSS was in this title, then it would be pretty easy to prevent, but as it stands I'd recommend this game at 1080 and 1440p, but I'd look into another card if 4K is more your forte. Counter-Strike 2, another DirectX 11 game built on the Source 2 engine, performed well but was overall depressed when comparing to the older and less graphically demanding CSGO. With an average and 1% low of 250 and 148 FPS at 1080p, the game was very playable and high refresh rate capable, and there wasn't that much to complain about besides some frame dips that occurred when smoke filled up the screen. 1440p didn't perform that much worse, with the average and 1% low of 228 and 139 FPS respectively. I wouldn't say that things match up to how the older Global Offensive implementation performed, but there's also not that much going wrong here. 4K saw its performance dip a bit more, but things were made playable with an achieved average of 136 and a 1% low of 90. Like I've said before with other titles, if gaming is what you're going to be doing on your PC, and you're looking to spend at or above $300, then the RTX 4060 or the RX 6700 XT would be the same price or even a little cheaper, and would perform better on average in this title. If you want to spend less and get similar performance, then the A750 returned an average and 1% low that was literally 4 FPS behind at 1080p, and the gap growing to 14 FPS at 1440p. That card honestly is the star of the Alchemist lineup right now, given it's not performing that much worse than the much more expensive and ably equipped A770. Cyberpunk 2077, a still very demanding title built on DirectX 12, performed well at 1080 and 1440p but fell apart once the resolution jumped up to 4K. With an average and 1% low of 111 and 88 FPS at 1080p, the A770 returned frame rates that are playable, but ultimately behind where the competition sits at this price point. 1440p brought the average down to 83 and the 1% low to 67, which remains playable but is once again just behind where competing current-gen offerings fall from the red and green team. 4K was also still technically playable, with an average and 1% low of 49 and 42 FPS, but I'd probably stick to at least 1440p to take advantage of higher performance. Additionally, I think that ZSS might be worth utilizing at all resolutions. The hit-to-image quality at the quality preset honestly doesn't look bad, and is comparable in terms of temporal stability to DLSS. The performance gains from turning on ZSS, though, is only around 15%, which is definitely something, but it's also not as large as DLSS. ZSS seems to be a savior for this card, especially at 4K, but even so I'd probably stick to the lower resolutions just to keep things feeling smoother. Up next is another DirectX 12 title, but this time with ultra textures to take advantage of the 16 gigs of memory on the A770. Fortnite, a still very popular competitive third-person shooter built on Unreal Engine 5, performed very competitively at all resolutions, even 4K despite the frame rate being overall depressed. With an average and 1% low of 184 and 124 FPS at 1080p, the game is very competitive on this hardware, moving up to 1440p, and the average came down to 126 FPS with the 1% low to 93. This is still very playable, though I will say that the A750 performs basically the same at these two resolutions, making the card seem more attractive than the A770 as it's roughly half the price. 4K returned an average and 1% low of 85 and 68 FPS, which remains playable and competitive, but at the end of the day I'd probably utilize the inbuilt temporal super resolution feature to squeeze a few more frames from the card. I mean, overall I think that there's not that much to complain about, but comparing the A770 to its little sibling, the A750, makes it kind of a tough sell when you get the same performance level from the cheaper offering. Up next is yet again another DirectX 12 based title, this time built on the IW 9.0 engine. Modern Warfare 3, this year's entry into the Call of Duty franchise, performed well at all resolutions, but ultimately behind where I was expecting it to when comparing against the A750. With an average and 1% low of 110 and 84 FPS at 1080p, the A770 returned playable, yet not really high refresh rate, capable frame rates that would allow you to play competitively. Keep in mind that we're testing at the basic settings here, meaning that things can be lowered a notch if you want to squeeze every last frame from the card. 1440p returned an average and 1% low of 91 and 71 FPS respectively, which is still playable, but is starting to lose the competitive edge. 4K was finally where things started to become non-competitive, but could probably pass if you were trying to play the zombies mode. This game also supports ZSS, so if you want extra frames, you can get them without much of a hit to image quality. It's worth looking into if you've got an ARC card. On its own, the A770 performs well in this game, but at the same time, so does the A750, making this card a tough recommendation if COD is one of your staple games. Building off of the previous title, Warzone 2, or now I guess just Warzone again, performed worse on average than the standalone Modern Warfare 3. With an average and 1% low of 93 and 50 FPS at 1080p, the overall performance could be improved slightly by lowering the settings to the minimum preset. But at the same time, this is more than playable and relatively competitive. I think it's worth noting that the 1% lows probably occurred during the drop-in phase, as I didn't notice anything this low during regular gameplay. Jumping up to 1440p, and the overall performance trend didn't seem super affected. With an average and 1% low of 80 and 44 FPS, things remained playable and competitive. But at the same time, if you want more raw frames, the slightly cheaper 4060 would actually come ahead by over 50 FPS on average at both 1080 and 1440p. Moving up to 4K, and while the A770 can technically run it without crashing to desktop, the 46 FPS average and 30 FPS 1% low tell a tale of a card that's starting to struggle. If you want to pick up the A770, then sticking to 1080 and 1440p in this title is probably the best. But at the same time, ZSS is in this game, and if you've been watching this video up to this point, you know that I'm definitely a fan and would recommend turning it on, at least at 1440p and above. I think Warzone on the A770 runs fine, but not exceptionally well, though not also drawing any performance to itself by performing poorly. Up next is a DirectX 11 title, which shares a lot of the same code as the older 1.0 version. Overwatch 2 overall ran competitively, but not as impressively as its similarly priced competition. Returning an average and 1% low of 275 and 114 FPS respectively, I think we may be CPU bound at the 1% lows, but the average was still lower than I was expecting. This game is actually one where the A770 kicks the crap out of the A750, with a 75 FPS lead on average at 1080 and 1440p. The A770 though returned an average and 1% low of 244 and 143 FPS at 1440p, which is weird considering the 1% lows actually went up by a not insignificant margin. 4K performed impressively when comparing the card to other Alchemist cards, with a 230 FPS average and 147 FPS 1% low. Comparing this to other $300 cards though, the only thing that makes sense is either the 4060 or 6700 XT when raw frame rates are the only things being considered. Overwatch as a whole is generally considered a pretty lightweight esports title, and the fact that it's struggling to break the 300 FPS mark on average at 1080p is kind of disappointing. I'm not sure if it's a shader occupancy issue or if some code path isn't being utilized on older graphics APIs, but competing cards with much weaker specs are able to hit over 400 FPS on average at 1080p with the same graphics preset. The last game in our test suite is the now 5-year-old but still gorgeous Red Dead Redemption 2. At the Xbox One X graphics settings from Digital Foundry, the A770 performed well considering this is one of the more demanding titles that we'll be testing. With an average and 1% low of 144 and 107 FPS at 1080p, this game is high refresh rate playable, but at the same time this game doesn't truly need any more than 60 FPS to be enjoyable. 1440p achieved an average of 108 and a 1% low of 77, which is once again very playable and makes for a very good experience. 4K also remained playable, with an average and 1% low of 59 and 49 FPS respectively, but at the end of the day I'd probably stick to 1440p. I remember FSR lighting being an issue when I first got the A750 back in December of 2022, and after playing around with it now it still happens, and it just makes things unplayable until it's turned off. It makes your screen get progressively darker. which for obvious reasons is a bad thing and makes me want to avoid the setting entirely. Overall, I think the A770 handles this game well, especially when the A750 achieves just over half the average performance at all resolutions. Overall though, is the A770 worth it, especially in a world where the A750 exists and is just over half the price? Well, I think the card has a place, but it's a pretty specific niche. If you're a gamer and you want an Intel card, then the A750 provides the majority of the performance of the A770 in modern titles like Cyberpunk, but lost quite heavily in older DirectX 11 games and Red Dead Redemption 2 for some reason. If raw performance is more your concern, then I would check out the RTX 4060 if it's cheaper or the same price in your region, as you'll get better performance in every title and also access to DLSS. The RX 7600 is also probably the best competitor if value is your only concern, with the 6700 XT looking much more attractive if you want the extra oomph. Other than raw performance, I think it's important to at least mention some of the frustrations I've had with the card. Small things like your secondary monitor momentarily turning off when setting games to full screen happens on this card but not on competing cards from Nvidia. The card also doesn't run DOSBox, which I got in the comments. I initially didn't think much of it, but I remember using it back in high school to be able to play Doom and Quake on school PCs. The fact that something like DOSBox doesn't work with this hardware is disappointing, and to be honest, I haven't experimented with emulations, so there might be more issues I'm just unaware of. If you want to be able to play modern titles or titles released in the past 15 or so years, then the A770 or any Alchemist card would be able to run it basically without question, admittedly occasionally with diminished performance. However, if you rely on older software with shaky hardware support, then I just stick to the manufacturer the developer recommends, which could be Intel for all I know. I just am aware that in the here and now, there are some holes in compatibility despite it being rather decent when it comes to gaming. So thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. Let me know what you guys think about the A750 and A770. Do they meet your performance expectations, or would you rather get something more powerful for a similar price? That's all I really have to say on the matter. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.